So that's maybe that's a helpful metaphor. Bookending inclusive education policy is a clear responsibility of provincial governments, and they can't defer that responsibility down to boards. That's their job. That's their role.
Absolutely.
To establish that.
Absolutely.
Okay, thanks very much, Bendina. Want to shift, Calvin, back to you to think about some of the challenges that teachers are facing. And we're getting some questions, I think, in response to your mapping out of the context that we're working within. And that's in relation to what seems to be, from one perspective, it could be read as a kind of fragmenting of a quality public education system with the demands for schools focused on particular ethno-racial groups, arts schools, sports schools, schools that appeal or serve a particular socio-economic class to try and address their disadvantage. And within that perspective, which can be justified from groups who are trying to claim their own kind of social identity and values and want an education system that respects that and reflects that. And the school for African Canadian children in Toronto is one example. Within that, there may be a new justification for special schools to serve students with intellectual disabilities. How do we move forward an inclusive education agenda in that context, or where that seems to be part of the trend, an increasing fragmentation? Or is it fragmentation? Is there possibility in this? Or is this a trend that concerns teachers and teacher federations who are committed to advancing inclusion?
I guess the short answer is yes, this is a trend that concerns teachers. They certainly recognize that the fragmentation exists. The fragmentation does have the potential to destroy public education because the fragmentation is part of a me-centered vision rather than a public-centered vision. That doesn't necessarily make the fragmentation wrong. It just means that there's a different role for all of the players in terms of creating a vision that works for all others. Bendina just spoke about the inclusion issue as a human rights issue. I would argue to you that on human rights in this last 5 years we've been going backwards in this country, both nationally and internationally. Mm-hmm. It's fascinating, though, how all of the issues and all of the practices that we're talking about here tie together, and how when you're dealing with one, you're really dealing with them all. Provincial governments set the bar. We all know that, and that's right. It's the way it should be. It's the way our whole system is structured. They are, of course, responsive to public perceptions, and I would argue that in some extent they're reactive to public perceptions and to the interests of special interest groups within the public. Notably those with money and loud voices. I would also argue that the policies and practices of provincial governments also create those perceptions, and that an awful lot of it is tied to accountability. And accountability to what? I guess in my view, true accountability is accountability to a vision, and that's a vision that has to include inclusion. But true accountability tied to a vision is expensive, it's time-consuming, and it's not always going to be popular, which is going to be problematic for anybody that needs to be elected.
So would you say that this trend towards fragmentation is here to stay and just to increase, the train has left the station, or does it present a fundamental risk to quality education that would ensure inclusion for all students?
I would argue that it is here to stay, and that it is our responsibility jointly to make sure that it doesn't represent any kind of fundamental risk.
Okay. So so we need to look at diverse forms of education appealing to different groups, but within that continue to require and set a standard at the provincial level that those various forms of education.
And that's where I keep coming back to the word accountability. I mean, accountability in our society has become equated to a test mark. Well, that's just foolish, because that's a very small portion of what we do, and it certainly works against the visionary things such as inclusion, where we have to build into that accountability a strong belief in everybody's mind, including the public, that no other alternative is acceptable. And to do that, we have to focus on building capacity, and that means it's about allocation of resources. And in too many places, we aren't allocating our resources for inclusion. We aren't allocating resources for meeting individual student needs. We're allocating resources for a very simplistic vision.
So here's a question that's come from one of our participants, a few of our participants, and I know is a burning question across the country that speaks directly to this point. We assume that meeting individual needs of students, of all students, can be accomplished in an inclusive classroom. We have a growing number of students, for whatever reason, who are identified as being on the autism spectrum. And for some learners on the autism spectrum, ABA, and that's a broadly defined set of therapies. There are a set of therapies which are most beneficial, it has been found, for some learners, and we also know it's hard to draw generalizations here, but in some circumstances are most beneficial where students have a quiet space on their own to with a resource teacher or assistant to assist in their own learning journey. Is that a fundamental risk? And I guess I open this up to our panelists. Is that push from many in the community of parents advocating for their children who have autism, does that present a fundamental challenge to inclusive education? Can we find a way of respecting and accommodating the needs of individual learners when that sometimes requires individual space? How do you tackle with that challenge with this overall commitment to an inclusive education system that we're looking for provincial governments to set? Bendina, Calvin, Minister Carr, I'll just open it up.
Well, I think we can't use a few situations as a reason not to move forward. And I think that inclusive systems, when done properly, accommodates autistic children that require space issues, sensory issues need to be accommodated. And so you have to go in with the premise that we need to provide a respectful and accommodating environment, and for those that full classroom for a full part of the day is not possible because of the student's needs, not because it's convenient or easy to have a child be removed from the classroom, but because it's based on their needs, then a truly inclusive system accommodates that. When the teacher and support staff and the parents are supported properly, we can again have a full complement of support and accommodation. No classroom should be considered a jail for any student, and so based on the students' needs that are truly the students' needs, and again I emphasize is not based on convenience because of it being a difficult task, then we can respect both. It does not have to be an either or.
Calvin, go ahead, Bendina.
I would agree with what the minister has just said. I think that every child in our schools has a time when being out of the regular classroom, doing something in another setting, doing something in another way, in an instructional or educational way, makes sense. So all children should have an opportunity when it is meeting their needs to be out of the classroom. And we can all think of key examples where kids spend time outside the regular classroom. I think the other aspect is, and I know we don't have a lot of time to talk about it, but I haven't had direct experience where parents have demanded ABA, so that has not been an experience. But I think one of the reasons we haven't had that direct experience is because we have required that all of our support staff involved with our students who have autism do participate in specific autism training within our school district. So I think as part of it is also building confidence for parents that public education can meet the needs of their children. And I'm not, again, trying to be Pollyanna and say that all children in my previous school district have their needs met. But I can tell you that there is a commitment to do the best possible and to make the adjustments necessary and to be as successful as possible.
Thanks, Bendina. One last question. We just have a couple of minutes left that I'd like to pose to Calvin Fraser. And I guess, Calvin, from your perspective, more, I guess, as Secretary General of the Canadian Teachers Federation, the issue we've just been talking about is one of the many issues that teachers are facing and raising as they try to advance inclusion. And as I said in my opening remarks, the surveys are clear. Teachers are more and more committed to inclusive education. They want to make it work. They're also raising, as you've said, the resourcing issues, which we know are only going to get bigger. But as we try to build partnerships and solidarity for this cause, one of the challenges, and I speak here as a community member, one of the challenges is when a provincial teachers federation comes out and says, we're not getting the resources we need from the provincial government, therefore, on a policy, as a matter of policy, we're pulling back from our support for inclusive education. That's just happened in Manitoba recently when I was there for an education conference in the fall. Can you help us understand how to work with teachers federations? Because we on the community side find those kinds of statements very difficult and challenging. What kind of words of encouragement can you give us to try and get across, to build bridges so that in fact we are continue to work in partnership? Because I've certainly valued your leadership and our partnership with the Canadian Teachers Federation over the years on this issue. How do we keep building that and strengthening that?
When teachers take a position like that, what they're really saying to you is we're being set up for failure with what we're doing, and therefore we can't continue with what we're doing. And obviously they're trying to pressure change to bring about a better vision that provides the resources that are needed, at least satisfactory resources to have some hope for success. I think if we want to build the partnership, we just have to keep plugging at it. We have to keep taking opportunities like this, opportunities like the conference we did earlier, opportunities such as getting into each other's publications, opportunities to interact on the broadest possible basis so that we aren't seeing each other in the extremes. And I was going to jump in earlier when the Minister and Bendina basically said the same things I was going to say, and that is that you don't just set up your whole system based on the extremes.
Right. Well, that's maybe a fitting place to bring this conversation to an end. I think we've heard from all our speakers about the importance of standing firm on our values of inclusion, recognizing we've got to build leadership at multiple levels, recognizing that not one size necessarily fits all, but that we need to be responsive to those individual situations in a way that continues to ensure that all students have an opportunity to learn together. I want to thank each of our speakers for their perspectives and their time today, and for all of those who joined us on this webinar. I also want to very much thank Community Living Ontario for creating the platform so that we could host this webinar today, and want to encourage all of our participants to, you can continue to send your questions to iewebinar@communitylivingontario.ca.